Thomas had always felt like he saw the world differently than others. In his neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, while most kids spent their afternoons playing basketball at the local courts or hanging out on front stoops, Thomas could usually be found sitting cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by math books. "Boy, what are you doing inside on such a beautiful day?" his grandmother would ask, poking her head into his room. The afternoon sunlight would stream through, the faded blue curtains illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air. "Just one more problem, Grandma," Thomas would reply, not looking up from his notebook where numbers and symbols marched across the page in neat rows. His love for numbers started early. At age 6, while other kids were learning to count to 100, Thomas was already figuring out multiplication in his head. By 12, he was correcting his math teacher's mistakes, which didn't always make him popular. And by 17, he was teaching himself calculus from old textbooks he'd found at neighborhood garage sales. "That boy's brain works like nothing I've ever seen," his mother would tell the ladies at the hospital where she worked cleaning rooms. "Numbers just make sense to him, like they're speaking their own special language, and somehow he was born knowing how to understand it." Life wasn't easy for their family. Thomas's father had passed away when Thomas was just 8 years old, a heart attack that came without warning one summer evening. After that, it was just Thomas, his mother, and his grandmother in their small, 2-bedroom apartment. His mother often worked double shifts as a hospital custodian to keep food on the table and the lights on. Despite the challenges, Thomas never complained. Instead, he poured himself into his studies, especially mathematics. He'd stay up late into the night, the soft glow of his desk lamp casting shadows on the walls as he worked through problem after problem. There was something peaceful about mathematics, a world where things either made sense or they didn't, where there were concrete answers waiting to be discovered. When the letter arrived from Westmore University, Thomas stared at it for nearly 10 minutes before finding the courage to open it. His hands trembled as he tore the envelope and pulled out the heavy cream-colored paper inside. "Full academic scholarship," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother, who had just walked in from her evening shift, dropped her purse on the kitchen table. "What did you say, baby?" He looked up, tears shining in his eyes. "I got in, Mom. Full scholarship to Westmore." The kitchen erupted in joyful chaos. His mother screamed and pulled him into a tight hug that smelled of hospital disinfectant and the vanilla perfume she'd worn for as long as he could remember. His grandmother shuffled in from her bedroom, still in her house slippers, demanding to know what all the commotion was about. When they told her, she raised her hands toward the ceiling. "Lord, you see this? You see what this boy has done?" She grabbed Thomas's face between her weathered hands. "Your daddy is looking downright, now busting with pride." Word spread quickly through their tight-knit neighborhood. Thomas was the first person from their community to receive a full ride to Westmore, an elite university known for producing Nobel Prize winners and Fortune 500 CEOs. The local barbershop put up a handmade sign, "Congratulations to our own math genius." The church ladies organized a special potluck dinner in his honor. "You're carrying all our hopes with you," Pastor Williams told him at the celebration, clasping his shoulder firmly. "But no pressure," he added with a wink. The summer passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Thomas's mother saved every extra penny to buy him new clothes, a sturdy backpack, and a laptop computer, his first ever. His grandmother knitted him a blue and gold scarf in Westmore's colors, working on it late into the evenings despite her arthritis. Then, finally, moving day arrived. They packed everything into his mother's aging sedan, clothes, books, the new laptop, and a small framed photo of his father. The drive to campus took almost 3 hours, and Thomas spent most of it staring out the window, watching the neighborhood. Streets give way to highways, then to the manicured lawns and impressive buildings of Westmore University. "Look at this place," his mother whispered as they drove through the main gates, past stone buildings covered in ivy and sprawling green quads where students lounged in the late summer sun. "You belong here now." Thomas wasn't so sure about that. As they unloaded his belongings into his freshman dorm room, he noticed the curious glances from other families, the quick looks that lingered a beat too long, the subtle raising of eyebrows. His roommate, a boy named Alex from Connecticut whose father was an investment banker, gave a stiff hello before continuing to arrange his expensive-looking electronics. After tearful goodbyes with his mother and grandmother, his grandmother pressing a $20 bill into his hand despite his protests, Thomas spent his first evening at Westmore University, unpacking his things and reviewing the schedule for the week ahead. He'd been placed directly into advanced mathematics courses based on his entrance exam scores, an unusual achievement for a freshman. His first real test came 3 days later in Dr. Harrison's advanced mathematical analysis class. The lecture hall was impressive. Rows of seats rising in a semicircle around a central podium, large windows letting in streams of natural light. Thomas arrived early and took a seat in the second row, his notebook open and pencils sharpened. As other students filed in, Thomas couldn't help but notice he was one of only 3 black students in a class of nearly 60. He took a deep breath, focusing on the clean whiteboard at the front of the room rather than the occasional curious glances thrown his way. When Dr. Harrison entered, a tall man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, the room immediately fell silent. He began the lecture without preamble, diving straight into complex theories and formulas that had Thomas scribbling notes frantically. About halfway through the class, Dr. Harrison posed a question about an equation he'd written on the board. Thomas saw the solution immediately. It practically jumped out at him from the jumble of symbols. He raised his hand. Dr. Harrison's eyes scanned the room, passing over Thomas completely. He called on a blonde girl sitting near the back. She gave an answer that Thomas knew was incomplete. Dr. Harrison nodded approvingly anyway. Thomas kept his hand raised. After calling on 2 more students, Dr. Harrison finally acknowledged him with a slight frown. "Yes, Mr. Thomas, sir. I think there might be another approach to this problem." The professor's eyebrows rose slightly. "By all means, enlighten us." Thomas explained his solution, walking through each step of his reasoning. As he spoke, he could feel the weight of everyone's attention on him. When he finished, the lecture hall was completely silent. Dr. Harrison studied the board for a long moment, his back to the class. "Well," he said finally, turning around with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes, "that's certainly an interesting interpretation. However, I think you'll find the conventional approach is more appropriate for our purposes. Next time, I suggest you follow the established methodology." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk with his lamp turned low while his roommate Alex snored softly across the room. The fielding prize brochure lay open before him, detailing past problems that made his head spin. Graduate level, topology, advanced number theory, abstract algebra concepts he'd only just begun to explore on his own. "What am I thinking?" he whispered to himself, running a hand over his face. The smart move would be to politely decline, to focus on his regular classes and prove himself gradually over time. But something burned inside him, a mixture of pride, determination, and the memory of his father's voice. "Son, sometimes you have to prove them wrong just to prove yourself right." By morning, Thomas had made up his mind. After his 8 a.m. class, he went straight to the mathematics department office and filled out the registration form for the fielding prize competition. The secretary raised her eyebrows as she took his form. "First-year student, you know what you're getting yourself into, right?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I believe I do." For the next 3 weeks, Thomas lived and breathed mathematics. His routine became monastic in its discipline. He woke at 5 a.m. to study before classes, attended lectures during the day, and then camped out in the library until it closed at midnight. He barely saw his roommate anymore except to shower and change clothes before disappearing again. Thomas's usual spot became the far corner table on the library's 3rd floor, surrounded by stacks of advanced textbooks and notebooks filled with his tidy handwriting. The librarians got used to seeing him there, his forehead creased in concentration, occasionally mumbling formulas to himself. "You need to eat something," said Mrs. Chen, the night librarian, placing an apple on his table. One evening, "Brain needs fuel." Thomas looked up, blinking like someone waking from a dream. "Oh, thank you." Mrs. Chen had a son about Thomas's age who was studying engineering at MIT. Something about this determined young man reminded her of her own boy. You study for Fielding Prize, yes? My son tried 2 years ago. Very difficult. Thomas nodded. No, but I have to try. Mrs. Chen studied him for a moment, then nodded as if deciding something. Wait here. She disappeared among the shelves and returned a few minutes later with a worn book that wasn't part of the library's collection. My son used this. Special approaches to advanced problems. You take. Return when finished. Thomas carefully took the book, opening it to find dense Chinese characters alongside mathematical symbols, but the symbols he understood perfectly, the universal language that had always made sense to him. I can't read the Chinese, he said hesitantly. Mrs. Chen smiled. Symbols same in any language. Mathematics is mathematics. That book became Thomas's secret weapon. Though he couldn't read the explanations, the worked examples showed approaches to complex problems that he'd never seen in American textbooks. Different ways of thinking about mathematical relationships that opened new doors in his mind. About a week before the competition, Thomas got another unexpected ally. He was working late in an empty classroom when Dr. Li, a young assistant professor, he knew only from passing in the hallways, stopped at the door. Still here at this hour? Dr. Li asked, surprised to find a student in the building so late. Thomas jumped slightly. Oh, yes, sir. Just working on some problems. Dr. Li glanced at the papers spread across the desk and raised his eyebrows. Fielding Prize practice problems? You're competing? Yes, sir. Thomas braced himself for another look of disbelief or dismissal. Instead, Dr. Li pulled up a chair. Mind if I take a look at your approach? For the next hour, they went through Thomas's solutions. Unlike Dr. Harrison, who seemed eager to find flaws, Dr. Li asked thoughtful questions and nodded appreciatively at Thomas's creative approaches. No, Dr. Li said finally. I've heard a lot about your unconventional methods from my colleagues. Something in his tone made it clear he didn't share their negative opinion. Your intuition for patterns is remarkable. Thank you, sir. But Dr. Harrison thinks I should stick to the established methods. Dr. Li was quiet for a moment. There's value in learning the traditional approaches, but mathematics doesn't advance by everyone thinking the same way. He stood up and headed to the door. My office is room 342. If you need a quiet place to study, I'm usually there until 9 p.m. and I wouldn't mind the company. The offer was delivered casually, but Thomas understood its significance. Here, finally, was a professor who wasn't looking at him like an intruder. Over the next few days, Thomas took Dr. Li up on his offer. The young professor never explicitly acknowledged the unfair treatment Thomas received, but he occasionally left relevant research papers accidentally on his desk while Thomas was there, or mentioned a particular theorem that might be useful for the competition. Mathematics doesn't care where you come from, Dr. Li told him one evening as they both worked quietly. It doesn't care about the color of your skin or your background or any of that. It only cares about the quality of your thinking. The night before the competition, Thomas called his grandmother. He'd been calling his mother almost daily, but tonight he needed his grandmother's particular brand of wisdom. Grandma, what if I fail? He asked, his voice smaller than he intended. What if they're right and I don't belong here? His grandmother's voice crackled through the phone, warm and certain. Let me tell you something, child. Your grandfather, God, rest his soul, used to say that fear is just excitement that ain't made up its mind yet. Thomas smiled despite himself. I don't feel excited. I feel terrified. That's because you're standing at the bottom of the mountain, looking all the way up. But listen here. You don't have to climb the whole thing tomorrow. You just gotta take the first step, and when you've taken that one, you take another. Before you know it, you'll look back and see how far you've come. But what if I can't solve the problems? What if they're too hard? His grandmother made a dismissive sound. Child, your whole life has been solving problems that others said were too hard. You think getting from where we started to where you are now was easy? You've been climbing mountains your whole life. This is just one more. After they hung up, Thomas took out the photo of his father that sat on his desk. In it, his father was smiling, one arm thrown casually around a younger version of his mother, the other holding baby Thomas. "I could use some of your courage tomorrow, Dad," Thomas whispered to the picture. He set his alarm for 6 a.m., laid out his clothes for the morning, and arranged his calculator, pencils, and scratch paper in his backpack. Then he did something he hadn't done in weeks. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. As he drifted off to sleep, equations and formulas swam through his mind. But alongside the mathematics was his father's old saying, "Sometimes you have to prove them wrong just to prove yourself right." And his grandmother's voice, "You've been climbing mountains your whole life." Tomorrow would bring the biggest test he had ever faced. But for the first time since arriving at Westmore, Thomas felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened, he would face it with everything he had. And that would have to be enough. "Excuse me, Professor. I was wondering if I could go over my exam with you. I'm not sure I understand where I went wrong." Dr. Harrison looked up with a frown, as if Thomas had interrupted something important. "Office hours are posted on the syllabus. Mr. Thomas." "I know, sir. I tried to come yesterday, but you were in a department meeting." With a heavy sigh that suggested enormous patience being tested, Dr. Harrison held out his hand. "Let me see it." Thomas handed over the exam and watched as the professor flipped through it with barely concealed impatience. "Your approach is unorthodox," Dr. Harrison said finally. "You're not following the methods I've taught in class." "But I got the right answers," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice respectful. "I just found a different way to—" "Mathematics isn't just about getting the right answer," Dr. Harrison cut in. "It's about understanding the established frameworks and methodologies. Your way might work for this problem, but it won't always. You need to learn to follow instructions." Thomas bit his lip, holding back what he really wanted to say. Instead, he nodded. "I understand. I'll try to follow the textbook methods more closely next time." "Good." Dr. Harrison handed the exam back with a dismissive gesture. Then just as Thomas was about to leave, he added, "You know, some students simply aren't cut out for theoretical mathematics. There's no shame in exploring other majors more suited to your talents." The words stung like a slap. Thomas mumbled a thank you and quickly left the office, his chest tight with humiliation and anger. What Thomas didn't see was what happened after he left. Dr. Harrison immediately picked up his phone and called Dr. Wilson, the department chair. "Patricia? Richard here. Got a minute to talk about that scholarship student?" 20 minutes later, Dr. Harrison was sitting in Dr. Wilson's spacious office, which overlooked the main campus quad. Unlike Dr. Harrison's cluttered workspace, Dr. Wilson's office was immaculately organized, with awards and diplomas displayed prominently on the walls. "He's persistent, I'll give him that," Dr. Harrison said, tapping his fingers on the armrest of his chair. "But I'm concerned about the message we're sending by letting him continue. The department has standards." Dr. Wilson, a thin woman with short gray hair and piercing blue eyes, nodded thoughtfully. "I've reviewed his application materials. His high school wasn't exactly known for academic rigor. I suspect admissions was influenced by other factors." "Precisely," Dr. Harrison leaned forward. "And now we're left to deal with the consequences. He simply can't keep up. It's affecting the entire class. I have to slow down to accommodate him." This wasn't true, and both professors knew it. Thomas was, if anything, ahead of most students. But neither acknowledged this fact. Dr. Wilson stood up and walked to her window, looking out over the campus where students hurried between classes. "The board has been pushing for more diversity in STEM programs," she said after a moment. "They won't be happy if we recommend removing him without solid evidence." "What do you suggest then?" Dr. Wilson turned back from the window with a slight smile. "The fielding prize competition is next month." Dr. Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "You can't be serious. First-year students never even place in the top 20. "Exactly." Dr. Wilson returned to her desk and sat down. "It would be the perfect opportunity to demonstrate objectively that he's out of his depth. We could encourage him to participate. When he fails spectacularly, we'll have irrefutable evidence that he doesn't belong in our advanced program." Dr. Harrison considered this for a moment, then slowly smiled. "And we'd be seen as supportive." giving him a chance to prove himself. Precisely. It's brilliant, Patricia. The next day after class, Thomas was surprised when Dr. Wilson appeared in the doorway of the lecture hall. She waited until most students had left before approaching him. Thomas, isn't it? Could I have a word? Confused, Thomas nodded. Of course, Dr. Wilson. She led him to a quiet corner of the hallway. Up close, her smile seemed practiced, not reaching, her eyes which remained cold and assessing. Dr. Harrison has been telling me about your unique approach to problem solving, she said, her voice sweet in a way that immediately put Thomas on guard. I'm trying to follow the methods in class more carefully, Thomas said quickly. Oh, no, that's not what I meant at all. Dr. Wilson waved a hand dismissively. Creative thinking is valuable in mathematics. In fact, that's why I wanted to speak with you. Thomas waited, not sure where this was going. Are you familiar with the Fielding Prize competition? She asked. I've heard of it, Thomas replied cautiously. It's for upper-level students, isn't it? Traditionally, yes. But there's no actual rule against first-year students participating. Her smile widened. We think you should consider entering. Thomas blinked in surprise. Me? But I'm just a freshman. Sometimes exceptional students need exceptional challenges. Dr. Wilson placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. It would be enlightening for everyone. Something in her tone made Thomas uneasy. This sudden interest in his abilities seemed out of place after weeks of being treated like an unwanted intruder in the department. Still, the opportunity to prove himself was tempting. When is the competition? He asked. 3 weeks from Saturday. Registration closes this Friday. Dr. Wilson handed him a glossy brochure. Think about it. It could be a wonderful opportunity for you to show everyone what you're truly capable of. As he watched her walk away, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He looked down at the brochure in his hand. The Fielding Prize was Westmore's most prestigious mathematics competition, a grueling 6-hour exam covering material well beyond first-year courses. According to the brochure, no freshman had ever placed in the top 10. He pulled out his phone and called his mother. They want me to enter this big math competition, he explained after telling her about his conversation with Dr. Wilson. But I think they're setting me up to fail. His mother was quiet for a moment. You think they don't believe you can do it? I know they don't. Then I guess you have a choice to make, she said finally. You can walk away or you can show them exactly who they're dealing with. I could use some of your courage tomorrow, Dad, Thomas whispered to the picture. He set his alarm for 6 a.m., laid out his clothes for the morning, and arranged his calculator, pencils, and scratch paper in his backpack. Then he did something he hadn't done in weeks. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. As he drifted off to sleep, equations and formulas swam through his mind. But alongside the mathematics was his father's old saying, sometimes you have to prove them wrong, just to prove yourself right. And his grandmother's voice, you've been climbing mountains your whole life. Tomorrow would bring the biggest test he had ever faced. But for the first time since arriving at Westmore, Thomas felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever happened, he would face it with everything he had, and that would have to be enough. The morning of the Fielding Prize competition arrived with golden sunshine streaming through the windows of Thomas's dorm room. He woke before his alarm, his mind already alert, his body tense with anticipation. Outside, the campus was quiet, most students still asleep on this Saturday morning. Thomas followed his usual routine: shower, brush teeth, dress. But each movement felt weighted with importance. He chose a light blue button-up shirt his mother had bought him specifically for special occasions and his nicest pair of jeans. As he tied his shoes, Alex stirred in the bed across the room. Big day, huh? Alex mumbled, still half asleep. Yeah, Thomas replied, surprised his roommate had remembered. Alex propped himself up on one elbow. Good luck, man, seriously. Thanks. Thomas grabbed his carefully packed backpack and headed out. The campus was beginning to come to life with A few early risers jogging along the paths or walking sleepy dogs. Thomas stopped at the small campus cafe for a cup of tea and a banana. He couldn't stomach anything more substantial. By 8:30 a.m., he was outside the grand hall where the competition would take place. Other students were already gathering, many with tired faces and cups of coffee clutched in their hands like lifelines. Thomas recognized most of them from upper-level math courses or department events. A few were graduate students whom he'd seen working as teaching assistants. "First year, right?" asked a tall guy with glasses as Thomas joined the line to sign in. "I think I've seen you in Harrison's class." Thomas nodded. "Brave of you to try the fielding. I waited until my junior year and still got crushed." He offered his hand. "I'm Ben." Thomas. "Well, good luck in there. The problems are brutal, but don't let that get to you. Just do what you can." Inside the grand hall, rows of tables had been set up with plenty of space between them. At the front of the room was a large digital clock, currently showing 8:45 a.m. The competition would begin at 9 sharp and run for 6 hours straight. Thomas found his assigned seat and carefully arranged his tools: calculator, pencils, erasers, and a bottle of water. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. As more students filed in, he took deep breaths, trying to steady himself. At the back of the room, Dr. Harrison and Dr. Wilson stood watching the proceedings. Their eyes found Thomas, and Dr. Wilson whispered something that made Dr. Harrison smile slightly. Thomas quickly looked away, focusing on his blank notepad instead. At 8:55, a stern-looking older professor Thomas didn't recognize stepped to the front of the room. "Good morning. I'm Dr. Landry, head of the Fielding Prize Committee. You each have an envelope on your desk containing the 6 problems for today's competition. You may not open these until I give the signal. You have 6 hours to complete as many of the problems as possible. Partial credit will be awarded for correct approaches even if the final answer is not reached." Thomas stared at the sealed envelope on his desk. It seemed to pulse with menace, like something alive. "Remember," Dr. Landry continued, "this is an individual competition. Any communication with other participants will result in immediate disqualification. You may use the restroom by raising your hand for an escort. The clock starts now." Throughout the hall, the sound of tearing paper filled the air as 63 students opened their envelopes at once. Thomas carefully removed the stapled packet and laid it flat before him. His heart sank as he scanned the first problem. It involved a complex topological question that he'd only glimpsed in his late-night studies. The second problem was even worse: a convoluted scenario involving non-Euclidean geometry. The third made his breath catch: a challenging but beautiful number theory problem that seemed vaguely familiar. For 15 terrible minutes, panic threatened to overwhelm him. Thomas stared at the problems, his mind uncharacteristically blank. Around him, he could hear the scratch of pencils as other students dived into their work. Some were already filling pages with calculations. "I can't do this," he thought, his grandmother's mountain suddenly looking impossibly high. They were right. I don't belong here. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. His father's words came back to him. Sometimes you have to prove them wrong just to prove yourself right. And then, unexpectedly, he remembered something Mrs. Chen had said when she gave him that book. Symbols same in any language. Mathematics is mathematics. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at the problems again. Instead of seeing impossible barriers, he tried to see them as puzzles waiting to be unlocked. He skipped ahead to problem 4, then 5, then 6, just scanning them briefly. The 6th problem made him pause. It dealt with a particular type of sequence that he'd explored in Mrs. Chen's book. "Start where you can," he whispered to himself, and turned back to the 3rd problem, the number theory question that had seemed vaguely familiar. Instead of approaching it through the standard methods he'd learned in class, Thomas began developing an alternative solution using techniques he'd discovered in his late-night studies. He remembered Dr. Lee's words: "Mathematics doesn't advance by everyone thinking the same way." Time seemed to stretch and compress strangely. Thomas became so absorbed in the problems that he barely noticed as 1 hour turned into 2, and then 3. When he finally looked up to stretch his neck, he was surprised to see that 4 hours had passed. His notepad was filled with calculations, diagrams, and half-formed solutions. He had completed solid approaches to problems 3 and 6, and was making headway on problems 1 and 4. Problems 2 and 5 still loomed intimidatingly. But, for the first time, Thomas felt a spark of hope. He might not win, but he wouldn't embarrass himself either. In the back of the room, Dr. Harrison and Dr. Wilson had returned to check on the progress. They observed the hunched figure of Thomas surrounded by filled pages, his forehead creased in concentration. "How's our experiment going?" Dr. Wilson whispered. Dr. Harrison shrugged. "Hard to tell from here, but the problems this year are particularly challenging. I doubt he's making much progress." For the final 2 hours, Thomas pushed himself harder than he ever had before. His hand cramped from writing, and his back ached from bending over the desk. But his mind was alight with connections and patterns. Where others saw impenetrable complexity, he found links to concepts he'd studied on his own. With 30 minutes left, Thomas returned to problem 2, the one he'd thought impossible. But now, with most of the other problems at least partially solved, he saw it differently. There was an approach using a combination of the techniques he'd applied to problems 3 and 6. It was unorthodox, possibly even wrong, but it felt right. 15 minutes remaining, Dr. Landry announced. Around the room there were groans and the frantic sound of pencils racing against time. Thomas was lost in his work, barely hearing the warning. His solution to problem 2 was taking shape. Unusual, but elegant. 5 minutes. Thomas finished his approach to problem 2 and quickly checked over his work on the other problems, making small corrections and clarifications where needed. He hadn't fully solved every problem, but he'd made substantial progress on 5 out of 6, far more than he'd dared hope when he first saw the questions. "Time's up. Please put down your pencils and stay seated while we collect your work." Thomas sat back, exhausted but oddly satisfied. Whatever the outcome, he knew he'd done his absolute best. As volunteer graduate students moved through the rows, collecting the answer packets, Thomas caught Dr. Harrison watching him. The professor quickly looked away, but not before Thomas noticed something unexpected in his expression: uncertainty. Outside the hall, students gathered in small groups, comparing approaches and commiserating over the difficulty of the problems. "That was brutal," Ben said, finding Thomas in the crowd. "Problem 2 was impossible." Thomas just nodded, not wanting to say that he'd found an approach to it. "How'd you do overall?" Ben asked. "I'm not sure," Thomas replied honestly. "I tried my best." As he walked back to his dorm room, physically exhausted but mentally still buzzing, Thomas felt different. For 6 hours he hadn't been the outsider, the scholarship kid, the one who didn't belong. He'd just been a mathematician, wrestling with beautiful, challenging problems. And for the first time since arriving at Westmore, that felt like enough. For 3 days after the competition, Thomas tried to focus on his regular classes, but his mind kept drifting back to the Fielding Prize problems. Had his unorthodox approaches been valid? Would the judges recognize his methods, or dismiss them like Dr. Harrison did in class? The waiting was almost worse than the competition itself. "You look like you haven't slept in days," Alex commented as Thomas shuffled around their dorm room on Tuesday morning, gathering books for class. "I keep second-guessing myself," Thomas admitted, wondering if I could have solved that 5th problem if I just looked at it differently. Alex shook his head. "Man, the fact that you're even talking about which problems you might have solved is wild. Most freshmen wouldn't have understood the questions, let alone had answers." All across campus, it seemed like everyone was talking about the competition. Thomas overheard snippets of conversations as he walked between classes. "Did you see problem 2? Absolutely impossible. I heard Professor Reynolds couldn't even solve the 6th problem. They say the grad students are complaining it was too hard this year." Each comment made Thomas's stomach twist. He'd attempted solutions for 5 of the 6 problems, including the supposedly impossible second one. What if he'd been completely wrong? What if his approaches were so far off base that the judges would laugh at his paper? On Wednesday morning, Thomas was eating breakfast alone in the dining hall when Ben, the friendly competitor he'd met at the competition, dropped in too. The seat across from him. "You're all everyone's talking about," Ben said without preamble. Thomas nearly choked on his cereal. "What? Why?" "Word is that some freshmen might have actually placed this year, and since you're literally the only freshman who entered." Ben raised his eyebrows meaningfully. "That's just a rumor," Thomas said quickly. "Nobody knows the results yet." "Maybe, but Professor Landry was seen practically running to the dean's office yesterday with a stack of papers. Something's up." Thomas pushed his half-eaten breakfast away, his appetite gone. "When do they officially announce the results?" "Tomorrow morning. They'll post them outside the math department at 9 a.m. Ben stood to leave, then paused. "Whatever happens, you've got guts, man. Respect for even trying." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep at all. He called his mother around midnight, waking her up. "I'm sorry, Mom, I shouldn't have called so late." "Nonsense," she said, her voice warm despite being pulled from sleep. "What's wrong, baby?" "The results come out tomorrow." "I'm scared." His mother was quiet for a moment. Scared of what exactly? Thomas hadn't really examined this question. "I'm not sure. If I did badly, they'll think they were right about me all along. But if I did well, I don't know if that's better or worse." "Listen to me," his mother said firmly. "The only thing that matters is what you think of yourself. Did you do your best?" "Yes." "Are you proud of the work you did?" Thomas thought about the elegant solutions he'd found, the connections he'd made that weren't in any textbook. "Yes, I am." "Then whatever number they put next to your name tomorrow doesn't change who you are or what you can do. Remember that." Thursday morning dawned bright and clear. Thomas was up early, too anxious to stay in bed. He showered, dressed carefully, in a clean shirt and jeans, and headed out with plenty of time to spare before the 9 a.m. posting. To his surprise, a small crowd had already gathered outside the mathematics department. As he approached, he recognized fellow competitors, math professors, and even some students from his classes who normally showed no interest in departmental events. "There he is," someone whispered as he approached, and several heads turned his way. Thomas felt his face grow warm. He slowed his pace, suddenly reluctant to reach the notice board where his fate was displayed. Through the small crowd, he caught a glimpse of Dr. Harrison and Dr. Wilson standing slightly apart, their faces unreadable. Just then, someone pushed through from the front of the crowd. It was Ben, his face split in a huge grin. "Dude!" Ben grabbed Thomas's arm. "Have you seen it yet?" Thomas shook his head, his throat too dry to speak. "Come on!" Ben pulled him forward, the crowd parting to let them through. And there it was, a simple printed list taped to the department bulletin board. Fielding prize results. Thomas Washington, first-year student, Danica Reynolds, graduate student, Benjamin Crawford. Jr. Thomas stared at the paper, certain he was hallucinating. His name? In first place. Not just placing, winning. The first freshman ever to win the Fielding Prize in its 42-year history. "I checked with Professor Landry," Ben said, still grinning. "You got a perfect score on problems 1, 3, and 6. And your approach to problem 2? They're saying it's revolutionary, a completely new way of looking at non-Euclidean applications. They're talking about publishing your solution." Thomas couldn't speak. The room seemed to be spinning slightly. From the corner of his eye, he could see Dr. Harrison's face had gone pale, while Dr. Wilson was furiously whispering something to him. Dr. Lee appeared at Thomas's side, beaming with genuine pride. "Congratulations," he said simply. "Though I can't say I'm surprised." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Students he'd never spoken to were stopping him to offer congratulations. Professors who had previously looked through him were suddenly finding reasons to speak with him. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his mother and grandmother, who had somehow already heard the news. That afternoon, Thomas received an email requesting his presence in the dean's office at 4 p.m. When he arrived, he found not only Dean Carter but also Dr. Wilson, Dr. Harrison, and two older men he didn't recognize who were introduced as members of the university's Board of Trustees. "Mr. Washington," Dean Carter began, her voice formal but warm, "your performance on the Fielding Prize was nothing short of extraordinary. The examining committee noted that you developed novel solutions to 3 of the problems, approaches that might warrant publication in mathematical journals." Dr. Harrison stared at the floor, his face ashen. Dr. Wilson managed a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "In light of your exceptional achievement," the dean continued, "the department is offering you direct admission to our Advanced Studies program, with full funding and a research position." What the dean didn't say, but what Thomas suspected from the tension in the room, was that his victory had exposed something uncomfortable about the mathematics department. The 2 trustees kept glancing at Dr. Harrison and Dr. Wilson with obvious disapproval. As Thomas left the meeting, his phone rang. It was his mother. "I don't know what happened, baby, but I just got flowers delivered to me at work," she said, her voice confused and happy. "The card says, 'From the proud mother of Westmore University's Fielding Prize winner.'" Thomas smiled, tears welling in his eyes. "Mom, do you remember when Dad used to say sometimes you have to prove them wrong just to prove yourself right?" "I do, baby." "Well," Thomas said, looking back at the dean's office where a difficult but necessary conversation was continuing without him. "Sometimes when you prove yourself right, you end up changing more than just your own story." In the weeks that followed, Thomas's victory became a catalyst for change at Westmore. It wasn't immediate or perfect, but things began to shift. New mentorship programs were established for students from underrepresented backgrounds. Hiring. Practices for teaching assistants and faculty were revised to reduce bias, and a commission was formed to examine evaluation methods across departments. Dr. Harrison took an unexpected leave of absence for the following semester. Dr. Wilson issued a public apology about unconscious biases that may have affected student assessments and committed to attending diversity training. As for Thomas, he continued doing what he had always done, solving complex problems one equation at a time. But now, when he walked the hallways of the mathematics building, he walked with his head held high, no longer feeling like an outsider. On his desk in his dorm room, beside the photograph of his father, sat a small trophy, the Fielding Prize. But more valuable than the trophy were the doors it had opened, not just for him, but potentially for others who would come after him. "Sometimes," his grandmother told him on the phone one evening, "the good Lord puts us in difficult places not to punish us, but because we're the only ones strong enough to change them." Thomas looked at the pile of advanced research papers on his desk, his new project with Dr. Lee, and smiled. "I thought